It was a hot, sweltering afternoon in Florida, the kind of day where the humidity stuck to your skin like a second layer, making it hard to tell where your sweat ended and the air began. The sun hung low in the sky, burning with an almost oppressive heat. Yet the small church on the outskirts of Miami, a modest brick building surrounded by palm trees and a cracked parking lot, seemed peaceful, a place where the people of the community came together every Sunday to listen to the Word of God. Pastor Daniel Monroe had been a familiar face in the church for over 10 years. With his deep voice, neatly pressed suits, and charismatic sermons, he had earned the trust and respect of everyone who attended. His wife, Rebecca, always sat at his side, smiling warmly at the congregation, a perfect picture of a happy and loving family. No one ever suspected anything out of the ordinary about their relationship. To the outside world, Daniel and Rebecca Monroe were a perfect couple, devout in their faith and deeply involved in the church. But behind closed doors, there were secrets, secrets that would soon unravel in the most horrifying way. Daniel's cousin, Michael, had been living with them for the past few months. He had fallen on hard times, his life a mess of failed relationships and financial ruin. Rebecca, ever the compassionate woman, had insisted they take him in. Daniel, though uncomfortable with the arrangement, had agreed, though not without his own reservations. It wasn't long before Michael and Daniel's relationship began to blur the lines of familial affection. Late one evening, the house fell eerily silent, save for the occasional chirp of crickets from outside. Inside, the lights flickered dimly, casting long shadows on the walls of the Monroe household. Daniel sat in his study, staring at his reflection in the dark window, a glass of whiskey in hand. The weight of the secret he'd been keeping from his family, from his congregation, was becoming unbearable. For months, Daniel had been secretly having an affair with Michael. The affair had started innocently enough, a few flirtatious conversations, stolen glances and casual touches. But it had escalated into something darker. They both knew it was wrong. They knew it could ruin everything. But they couldn't stop. They found themselves lost in each other's company, drawn together by an undeniable force neither could explain. But now the truth was about to come out. The pressure was mounting. Daniel felt trapped. As he sat in the dim light, the door creaked open, and Rebecca stepped into the room. She was holding a cup of tea, her eyes warm with concern. She always had a way of reading him, sensing when something was wrong, even when he hid it well. She sat beside him and placed the cup on the table. "Daniel, what's going on?" "You've been distant lately," she said, her voice soft but firm. Daniel looked at her, his heart pounding. His mind raced for an excuse, for a way out of the lie that had spiraled out of control. But before he could speak, the sound of a car door slamming outside interrupted the moment. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he realized who had just arrived. It was Michael. Rebecca looked over her shoulder, noting the change in Daniel's demeanor. She stood up, brushing her hands together, as if wiping away the heaviness in the room. "I'll go check on him. You should get some rest," she said. Daniel's mind was in turmoil. He wanted to stop her, to prevent what he knew was coming, but the words wouldn't leave his lips. His body was paralyzed with fear and guilt. As Rebecca walked out of the room, Daniel stared after her, his fingers tightening around the glass in his hand. He had to do something, fast. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by muffled voices. Daniel's breath quickened as he rose from his chair, his mind racing through possibilities. He could leave, escape the life he had built, and run away with Michael. But there was too much to lose. The church, his reputation, everything. There was only one way to solve this. Rebecca entered the living room, greeting Michael with a smile. But as she did, she noticed something in his eyes. Something cold, something that made her heart race. Michael had always been a little unpredictable, but this was different. She tried to brush off the unease creeping up her spine as she turned to head back to the kitchen. But as she reached for the door, it happened. The sharp crack of a gunshot echoed through the house, followed by a scream. It was Rebecca's scream. Daniel froze in terror as he heard the commotion in the other room. He had been unable to stop himself, and now the nightmare had begun. He rushed into the hallway just in time to see Rebecca collapse to the floor, blood pooling around her. Michael was standing there holding the gun, his face expressionless. "It's over, Daniel," Michael said, his voice cold and emotionless. "We had to do it. She was going to ruin everything." Daniel stumbled backward, his mind in shock. He had never imagined it would come to this. But as he looked at Rebecca's lifeless body, he realized there was no turning back. And that's when the true horror began. The sound of silence that followed the gunshot seemed to stretch on forever, echoing through the halls of the Monroe household. Daniel's eyes were wide, his mind scrambling to comprehend the violent reality unfolding before him. His own wife, dead, lying on the floor in a pool of her own blood, with Michael standing above her, the gun still clenched in his trembling hand. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel stood frozen, a wave of disbelief and horror washing over him. His heart raced and his chest tightened as if the air itself had thickened and become suffocating. He should have stopped it. He should have done something sooner. But it was too late now. Michael's cold eyes met Daniel's, and in that instant, Daniel understood. Michael wasn't just a cousin anymore. He wasn't just a lost soul in need of help. Michael was a threat, someone willing to do anything to protect the dark secret that had consumed both of their lives. Daniel tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt dry, his body frozen in terror. He wanted to run, to leave it all behind, but his feet refused to move. He was trapped, caught in a nightmare that had no escape. "She was going to find out, Daniel," Michael said quietly, as if the murder was just a matter of fact. "She was getting too close. She already knew something was off. She wasn't blind, and she wasn't stupid. She would have told everyone, told the church. You would have lost everything. So I had to stop her, before it was too late." The words hit Daniel like a slap across the face. Michael's logic was twisted, but Daniel could hear the sincerity in his voice. To Michael, this wasn't just murder. It was survival. Survival in a world where their secrets would destroy them if anyone found out. Daniel blinked, trying to grasp the situation. His mind was foggy, but one thing was clear. He couldn't let Michael get away with this. He couldn't let him walk away from the crime scene without consequences. But as Daniel took a step toward his wife's body, something changed in Michael. His expression darkened, and his hand gripped the gun tighter. "Don't even think about it, Daniel," Michael warned, his voice low. "You saw what happened to Rebecca. Don't make me do the same to you." Daniel's breath caught in his chest. He took another step forward, but Michael raised the gun, pointing it directly at him. The heavy weight of the situation pressed down on Daniel's chest. The man he had trusted, the cousin he had taken into his home, was now a cold-blooded killer. "Michael, listen to me," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice calm. He didn't know what else to say. There was no reason left to plead. "We can fix this. We can leave. Start over somewhere else. We'll go far away from here, from the church, from everyone. We can be together, Michael. You don't have to do this." For a moment, Michael seemed to hesitate. His eyes flickered with doubt, just enough to show Daniel that he still had a chance. But then Michael's face hardened again, his grip on the gun tightening. "No," Michael muttered. "You don't get it, Daniel. You never did. This is the only way out. You're with me or you're against me." Daniel's mind raced. He needed to think of a way to survive this. If he didn't act fast, he was going to be next. He could try to overpower Michael, but the gun made that dangerous. And with Rebecca's body lying lifeless on the floor, there was no telling what Michael would do to him. The sound of footsteps outside the door startled them both. It was too late now to hide what had happened. The front door opened, and a voice called out, "Daniel, Michael, what's going on in there?" It was the neighbor, Mrs. Ellison, an elderly woman who lived across the street. She often stopped by to check on the Monroes, as they were good friends. She had no idea what had happened. She had no idea that the peaceful home she once admired had now become a crime scene. "Stay quiet," Michael hissed, turning toward the door. He looked at Daniel, his face filled with panic. "Don't you dare say a word, Daniel. Don't ruin everything." Daniel stood motionless, his mind screaming for him to act. But he didn't know what to do. Michael's grip on the gun was unwavering, and the look in his eyes was that of a man who had crossed a line. There was no going back. The door opened just a crack, and Mrs. Ellison's face appeared. She froze, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of the scene before her. Rebecca's body on the floor, blood staining the carpet, and Daniel standing there, helpless. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Mrs. Ellison's gaze flicked from the body to Daniel, and then to Michael, who was still holding the gun. The old woman opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, Michael was on her. In one swift motion, Michael grabbed her by the arm, yanking her into the house. His face twisted with rage, and before Daniel could process what was happening, Michael had the gun pressed against Mrs. Ellison's temple. "Shut up," Michael growled. "Stay quiet, or I swear I'll—" Daniel's mind snapped. The situation had gone from bad to worse. This wasn't just about protecting their secret anymore. Michael had gone too far, and now they were both trapped in a web of murder and lies. Daniel could hear his own pulse pounding in his ears, the blood rushing through his veins as he struggled to think of an escape. Before he could react, the sound of police sirens wailed in the distance. The house was surrounded. Mrs. Ellison's scream had been heard. The neighbors had called the authorities. Daniel turned toward Michael, eyes wide with panic. This was it. There was no way out now. The police were coming, and the investigation was about to begin. The aftermath of the chaos in the Monroe household was suffocating. The night air outside was thick with the tension of unanswered questions. But inside, the walls of the house seemed to close in around Daniel. The sound of police radios crackling and officers calling out orders blurred together, creating a dissonant noise that only added to the weight pressing on him. Daniel sat, his back stiff, his hands trembling in his lap, and his mind swirled with the storm of consequences that had only just begun. The police had secured the scene. Michael was gone. Rebecca, his beloved wife, was gone. His life, once built on trust and faith, was now lying in tatters around him. Daniel knew the truth would come out, and there was no avoiding it. Every secret, every sin, every lie he had buried for so long was now exposed, and there was no way to put the pieces back together. It was over. As the police officers moved through the house, gathering evidence, Detective Rachel Adams entered the room. She was a woman in her mid-40s, tall, composed, and a veteran of the force. Rachel had been called in to take charge of the investigation, and as she entered, her steely eyes immediately fixed on Daniel, who was still sitting in stunned silence. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice authoritative yet calm, "we need to talk." Daniel's eyes flickered up to meet hers. His mind was in turmoil. How could he explain everything to her? How could he confess what he had done, what had been done to him, without falling apart completely? He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, Detective." She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're not under arrest, Mr. Monroe, but you are going to be questioned. I'm going to be straight with you. The situation we have here is complicated. People are dead. Your wife, your cousin, and it looks like Michael tried to take Mrs. Ellison as a hostage before being shot by the police. We need to know exactly what happened." Daniel's chest tightened. The words felt like they were crushing him. "I don't know where to start," he said, his voice strained. Rachel nodded. "Start at the beginning. What happened tonight? Who else was involved? We need the truth." The truth. Daniel could feel it clawing at him, threatening to escape. But how much of it could he reveal? How much of it would make him a monster in the eyes of the world? Still, there was no choice now. The secrets he had hidden for so long couldn't be kept anymore. He had to speak. He had to explain it all. "It started a few months ago," Daniel began, his voice quiet. "Michael, he came to live with us. He was struggling, you know. He didn't know what to do with his life. I thought I could help him. I thought I could fix him, like some misguided savior." Rachel didn't interrupt, her eyes fixed on him as he continued, trying to get the words out. "We've always been close. We grew up together. But as time went on, I realized that our relationship was becoming something different, something I couldn't control. We became more than just cousins. It wasn't planned. I don't even know how it happened, but one thing led to another, and soon it became a secret, a dangerous one. I never wanted anyone to know." Rachel stayed silent, processing the information. She was no stranger to complex family dynamics, But this was something far darker than she had anticipated. It wasn't just a murder case. This was an entire life built on lies, deceit, and a devastating web of secrets. Daniel rubbed his hands over his face, exhausted from the weight of it all. But then Rebecca started noticing things. She started asking questions. She could tell something wasn't right. She kept pressing. Me, trying to get me to tell her what was going on. And I couldn't lie to her anymore. But I couldn't tell her the truth either. Not about Michael, not about what had been happening between us. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. She had heard enough to understand the core of what was going on. So, Rebecca found out, she said. She started asking too many questions, and Michael, in his desperation, tried to shut her up. Daniel's eyes flickered with pain. Yes, he admitted quietly. Michael couldn't handle it. He was afraid she would tell the police, or worse, expose us in front of the entire church. He didn't want to lose everything. And when he found out Rebecca was getting too close, he snapped. He killed her. Rachel's face was hard to read, but Daniel could see the shock in her eyes, though she kept her composure. And Mrs. Ellison, she asked, her voice even, though the tragedy of the situation hung in the air like a fog. She walked in at the wrong time, Daniel said. She was just in the wrong place, and Michael couldn't risk her telling anyone what she saw. So he took her hostage. He was panicked, irrational. He thought that if she spoke to the police, everything would come crashing down. Rachel's eyes narrowed. And then what happened? How did the police arrive? Daniel's gaze dropped to the floor, and he inhaled sharply, trying to steady his emotions. I tried to talk to Michael. I tried to stop him. I begged him to calm down, but he wouldn't listen. He was too far gone. And when the police arrived, when they started yelling at him through the door, Michael panicked even more. He used Mrs. Ellison as a shield. He pointed the gun at the officers, threatening to kill her if they didn't back off. Rachel's eyes flashed with understanding, and she slowly shook her head. So Michael was dead before the police could get to him. And now you're telling me that you were there, in the house, watching all of this happen? Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't do anything to stop it. Rachel leaned forward, studying him closely. Mr. Monroe, we're going to need more than just your side of the story. We're going to need evidence. We need to piece everything together. Because right now, this looks like a series of murders, and everything about this doesn't add up. Daniel felt his stomach churn at her words. The idea that he might be implicated in the deaths of Rebecca and Michael, both of them, was terrifying. It was a nightmare he hadn't even considered. His pulse quickened as he realized just how deep he was in. I'm telling you the truth, Daniel said, his voice trembling. I never wanted any of this. I never wanted Rebecca to die. I never wanted Michael to die. But I couldn't stop it. And now it's too late. Rachel paused, studying him for a moment longer, before she stood up. We'll need to continue questioning you, Mr. Monroe. But for now, you're free to go. We'll be in touch. Daniel didn't move as she left, the door clicking shut behind her. He was alone again, but the emptiness in the room felt even heavier. There was no turning back. The truth was out, and there was no escaping the fallout. The investigation had just begun, but Daniel knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of the end. He had lost everything. The house felt eerily quiet now. The hum of the police radios and the footsteps of officers moving through the rooms almost louder than anything else. Daniel Monroe sat in the living room, his hands clasped tightly together, his fingers digging into his palms as if he could still hold on to something, anything of the life he had lost. Michael's body had been removed, but the weight of the situation was crushing. The reality of what had just happened pressed in on him from every side. Rebecca was gone. His cousin, the man he had tried to protect and care for, was dead. And now the investigation would uncover the darkest secrets of his life, things he had hidden for years. Detective Rachel Adams stood across the room, her piercing eyes scanning the room and taking in every detail. She was calm, but there was a sharpness to her that cut through the tension in the air. She had seen this kind of chaos before, but there was something different about this case. The lies were thick, the motives twisted, and something told her that this wasn't just a simple case of murder. "Mr. Monroe," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the quiet, "we're going to need to hear your side of things. We know your cousin Michael was involved in Rebecca's death, but we need to understand what happened here. Why did this happen?" Daniel swallowed, his throat dry, his thoughts scattered. How could he explain? How could he tell her everything without losing himself? Completely in the process? There was so much at stake now. His marriage, his career, the church that had once been his life. "I don't know how to explain it," Daniel said, his voice shaky. It all spiraled out of control. I never wanted this to happen." Rachel Adams nodded, her gaze never leaving him. She could see that he was struggling, but she was patient. She'd been in this position before. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to justify their actions after everything had already fallen apart. "Let's start from the beginning," she said softly, her voice less commanding now. "Tell me about your relationship with Michael. Why was he here in your house, and what was going on between the two of you?" Daniel hesitated, his mind racing. He could feel the walls closing in on him. How could he tell her about the secret he had kept for so long? How could he explain the bond he had shared with Michael, the twisted relationship that had crossed lines they could never return from? "Michael came to live with us a few months ago," Daniel began, his voice distant. "He'd been struggling with his life, with his identity. I, I thought I could help him. He's family, after all. I thought I could guide him. But things were complicated between us. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to face the truth." Rachel remained silent, allowing him to speak. Daniel's voice trembled as he continued. "There was always something there, something hidden. But it wasn't until Rebecca started noticing the changes that things began to unravel. She started questioning things. She started asking about Michael and me, about why we were so close. She didn't know what was going on between us. Not fully, anyway. But she was getting too close to the truth." Rachel took a step forward, leaning in slightly. She could tell there was more to the story, but Daniel wasn't ready to reveal everything. He wasn't ready to admit the depth of what had been happening, but she could see the guilt in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of the confession that was slowly coming to light. "Did you and Michael have a romantic relationship?" Rachel asked bluntly, cutting through the fog of hesitation. "Is that what you're trying to say?" Daniel's face flushed, and his chest tightened. He didn't want to say it out loud, but the truth was unavoidable now. He couldn't hide it any longer. It wasn't just an affair or a fleeting mistake. It was something deeper, something that had torn apart everything he had ever believed in. "Yes," Daniel whispered, barely audible. "It was more than just a family bond. It, it became something else, something wrong, and I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to make it right." Rachel nodded slowly, processing the information. She had expected something along those lines, but hearing Daniel admit it made the case even more complex. There was so much more to this than simple murder. There were secrets, betrayals, and lies wrapped up in the fabric of Daniel's life, and now it was all spilling out. "I see," Rachel said, her voice calm but sharp. "So Michael found out that Rebecca was getting too close to the truth. He knew she was starting to piece things together." Daniel nodded, guilt washing over him. "Yes, and he couldn't stand the thought of her exposing everything. He thought that if she found out, everything would be destroyed. The church, the ministry, everything I've built." Rachel's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained focused. "So Michael killed her because he was afraid of losing everything." Daniel closed his eyes, unable to look at her anymore. He couldn't believe what had happened. His entire life, everything he had worked for, was now shattered. All of it was gone because of a secret he had tried to bury. "Rebecca was never supposed to know," Daniel murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to keep it hidden. I thought I could manage it. But she started asking questions. And when she confronted me, I didn't know how to lie to her anymore." "And then Michael killed her," Rachel said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Daniel nodded, his eyes downcast. "Yes, I never thought it would come to this. I never thought it would end in murder." Rachel paused, her eyes flicking over Daniel's face as she considered his words. And when Mrs. Ellison walked in, Michael thought she would tell the police what she saw, didn't he? Daniel nodded again. He panicked. He thought that if she spoke to the police, everything would come crashing down. He knew the truth would come out. Which is why he killed her too, Rachel said, because she was a witness. Daniel sat in silence, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Everything he had ever known was slipping through his fingers, and there was no going back. He had allowed this to happen. His actions, his inactions, everything had led to this moment. Mr. Monroe, Rachel said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. We're going to need a full confession. The details matter. The motive matters. We need everything if you want any chance at redemption. Daniel took a deep breath. Redemption? It seemed like a far-off, unreachable concept now. How could he be redeemed for something so vile, so unforgivable? I'll tell you everything, Daniel said, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. I'll tell you everything I know. And so, the truth began to unravel, slowly but inevitably. Piece by piece, Daniel confessed to everything. The lies, the betrayal, the twisted relationship with Michael, and the murder that had ended it all. Detective Adams listened, asking the questions that needed to be asked, but it was clear to her now that this wasn't just a simple murder case. This was about family, betrayal, and the crushing weight of secrets that had festered for years. As the hours passed, the investigation continued, but for Daniel, it was already too late. His world had fallen apart, and now he had to face the consequences of everything he had tried to hide. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. There would be no going back. Daniel Monroe sat alone in the interrogation room, the sterile, fluorescent lights overhead flickering faintly, creating an atmosphere that seemed to close in around him. The events of the past few days had blurred together into a series of fragmented moments. Moments of panic, guilt, and confusion. His mind seemed unable to process it all. The truth was now a chain around his neck, tightening with every word spoken, every look exchanged, and every detail uncovered. Since Rachel Adams' last visit, the investigation had only intensified. Daniel had been questioned multiple times, each session unearthing more uncomfortable truths about his life, his hidden relationship with Michael, the tension with his wife, the dangerous secrets he had tried to bury. But now the walls seemed to be closing in on him faster than he could keep up with. The detectives had taken him to the police station again, asking for his statement once more. But something had shifted. Rachel had stopped asking the same questions. Instead, she seemed to be playing a game, carefully waiting for him to unravel. She knew more than she was letting on, and it was clear she was using every word and movement to make him crack. As the door opened, Daniel's heart jumped into his throat. Rachel entered, flanked by another officer, a man Daniel hadn't seen before. He was tall, dark-haired, and his expression was unreadable. The officer sat down without a word, while Rachel remained standing, looking down at him as if she were surveying a piece of evidence. Mr. Monroe, Rachel began, her voice cool but firm, we've gathered new evidence. It's not looking good for you. Daniel flinched, his stomach twisting. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep pretending that the lies he'd woven for years were enough to protect him. The truth was out, and the weight of it threatened to crush him. I've told you everything I know, Daniel whispered, his voice weak. Michael did it. He killed Rebecca and Mrs. Ellison. I tried to stop him. I didn't want anyone to die. Rachel paused, staring at him for a moment. You say you tried to stop him, she repeated, her tone sharp. But the evidence doesn't support that, does it? Daniel looked up at her, confusion clouding his thoughts. What do you mean? What evidence? Rachel leaned forward slightly, folding her arms across her chest. We found something in your office, Daniel. Something that paints a different picture. Pictures of you and Michael. Intimate photographs. Ones that suggest you were involved in this more deeply than you've admitted. Daniel's throat tightened and his breath caught in his chest. The photographs. The ones he had hidden for so long. He had hoped that no one would ever find them, but Rachel had found them. And now everything he had tried to protect was laid bare. Those pictures. They were a mistake. Daniel said, his voice trembling. Michael and I, we, we lost ourselves. We were ashamed. I was ashamed, but I never wanted to go this far. Rachel's expression didn't soften. You didn't want it to go this far, she repeated. Daniel, your wife is dead. Your cousin is dead. Mrs. Ellison is dead. And you think telling me that you didn't want it to go this far will make it better? Daniel swallowed hard. I never wanted any of them to die, he said, his voice breaking. But Michael, he was out of control. I couldn't stop him. I tried. I swear I tried. Rachel shook her head, disappointment creeping into her voice. This doesn't add up. You keep saying you tried to stop him, but every time we question you, your story changes. First, you say you were in your room away from the scene. Now you're saying you tried to intervene. Which is it, Daniel? The walls of the room seemed to press in on him, his mind racing for some way to make her understand. He wanted to tell her everything, wanted to explain that he had never intended for any of this to happen, that his relationship with Michael had spiraled out of control, but there were no words left to fix what had been broken. I didn't want this, he repeated, his voice small now, as if the strength had drained from him entirely. I just didn't know how to stop it. Michael was threatening me. He was threatening everyone. Rachel sat down across from him, her gaze cold and calculating. It's too late for apologies, Daniel. We have your confession. The witnesses are clear. You knew more than you're admitting, and you were complicit in what happened. Daniel's chest tightened, his heart beat loud in his ears. The confession, the words he had said under pressure. They had dug a hole too deep for him to climb out of. He had hoped that somehow the truth would set him free, but it was only dragging him further into darkness. As Rachel stood up and motioned for the officer to follow her, she turned to him one last time. We'll be filing charges against you for accessory to murder, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. You're under arrest, Daniel. I suggest you start telling us the truth before this becomes something even worse. Daniel couldn't speak. The words caught in his throat, and his body felt numb. His mind raced back to that night, the night everything changed, the fight with Rebecca, the moment he realized he couldn't stop Michael anymore, the look in his cousin's eyes as he pulled the trigger. It was all spiraling out of control. He had tried to control the chaos, tried to protect everyone, but in the end, he had only fed the fire. As the officer placed the handcuffs around his wrists, Daniel's thoughts turned to the only thing that still held some semblance of hope, the possibility of redemption. But in that moment, he realized the one thing he had known deep down all along. Redemption wasn't a choice anymore. He couldn't go back. The damage had been done. The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, courtroom appearances, and the overwhelming weight of the public's judgment. Daniel was charged with multiple counts: accessory to murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and tampering with evidence. The media covered the case relentlessly, painting him as a man who had betrayed not only his wife, but his entire congregation. But in the quiet of his cell, as he waited for the trial to begin, one thought consumed him, one thought that refused to leave his mind. He had lost everything, and now there was no escaping the truth. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation as the trial of Daniel Monroe began. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled in their notebooks, and the buzz of whispered conversations filled the room. The public had followed the story from the beginning: the rise of a respected pastor, his sudden fall from grace, and the shocking deaths of his wife, cousin, and a beloved member of the community. Now they were all here, waiting to see justice served. Daniel Monroe sat in the defendant's chair, his once imposing figure reduced to a shadow of the man he had once been. His suit, once neatly pressed, now looked as if it had been worn 1,000 times. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow from days of sleepless nights and the weight of the charges against him. His lawyer, a seasoned criminal defense attorney named Robert Calloway, sat beside him, quietly going over notes as the jury filed in. The judge, an older woman with a stern expression, called the court to order. Her gavel struck with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as the proceedings began. The truth was out there, and now it would be examined under the harsh light of the law. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the judge began, her voice strong and unwavering. This is a trial for the accused, Daniel Monroe, who stands charged with accessory to murder, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. The prosecution will present its case, and the defense will have the opportunity to make its arguments. You are to remain impartial and base your judgment solely on the evidence presented. We will begin with the opening statements. The prosecutor, a tall man with a sharp, angular face named Thomas Hayes, stood and addressed the court. He spoke with authority, his voice steady as he laid out the case against Daniel. Daniel Monroe was a man who had it all, Hayes began, his eyes scanning the jury. A respected pastor, a loving husband, and a member of a community that trusted him. But behind closed doors, he was hiding a secret, one that would ultimately lead to the deaths of 3 people. He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words sink in. Monroe's secret was his illicit relationship with his cousin, Michael Ellison. When Michael threatened to expose the truth, Monroe, desperate to maintain his image, did nothing. He allowed his cousin to spiral further into madness, enabling him to commit murder. And when Michael killed Monroe's wife, Rebecca, and their family friend, Mrs. Ellison, Monroe did nothing to stop him. Instead, he covered up the evidence and lied to the authorities. Hayes pointed directly at Daniel, his voice growing more forceful. Daniel Monroe is not the victim here. He is a man who chose to protect his own reputation, even at the cost of innocent lives, and now he must answer for his actions. The prosecutor's words hung in the air like a suffocating fog, and Daniel could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, his hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent, knowing this was just the beginning. The defense attorney, Robert Calloway, stood to present his side of the story. He was a tall man with graying hair and a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the prosecution's fiery delivery. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Calloway began, his voice measured, we do not deny the tragedy of the events that took place. 3 lives were lost, and we mourn them just as much as the prosecution does. But what the prosecution fails to acknowledge is that Daniel Monroe was not a murderer. He was not an accomplice. He was a man caught in a situation far beyond his control. He glanced at Daniel before continuing. Daniel Monroe made a mistake. He allowed his relationship with his cousin to spiral out of control, but he never intended for anyone to be harmed. When Rebecca and Mrs. Ellison were killed, Daniel was horrified. He was a man in shock, trying to make sense of what was happening. He loved his wife, and he loved his cousin. He never imagined things would end like this. Calloway's eyes moved over the jury, trying to make a personal connection with them. The real culprit here is Michael Ellison. He was the one who killed Rebecca, and he was the one who took Mrs. Ellison's life. Yes, Daniel was involved, but not in the way the prosecution would have you believe. He did not encourage these crimes. He did not plan them. He was just a man who was too afraid, too caught up in the web of lies, to stop his cousin before it was too late. Calloway turned to the judge, his voice quiet but firm. Daniel Monroe should not be judged as a murderer. He should be judged for the mistakes he made in a time of panic and fear. But he did not kill anyone. The defense attorney sat back down, and the tension in the room thickened. Daniel knew the battle had just begun. The next few days would be filled with testimony, evidence, and arguments that would determine his fate. The trial dragged on for weeks. Witnesses were called, evidence presented, and the public's perception of Daniel shifted with every new revelation. The prosecution painted him as a man consumed by his need to protect his own image, willing to let others suffer for his mistakes. They argued that his inaction, his silence, and his complicity made him just as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger. But the defense fought back, presenting a portrait of a man who had been trapped in a situation far beyond his control. They argued that Daniel was a victim of his own choices, a man who had made grave errors but never intended to cause harm. They painted Michael Ellison as the true villain, a man who had manipulated and ultimately destroyed his own family. Throughout it all, Rachel Adams, the detective who had led the investigation, remained a silent but powerful presence in the background. She had testified early on, recounting her findings and the evidence she had uncovered. Her calm demeanor and unflinching commitment to the truth had left a lasting impression on the jury. But despite her work, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. He knew she had been watching him closely, waiting for him to crack. And then during the final days of the trial, a shocking revelation came to light. It was the defense's final witness, Dr. Samuel Klein, a forensic psychologist, who took the stand. Dr. Klein had been hired to evaluate Daniel's mental state at the time of the murders, and his testimony would prove crucial in determining Daniel's level of culpability. Dr. Klein explained that Daniel had been under extreme emotional distress in the months leading up to the murders. He had been dealing with an overwhelming sense of guilt over his secret relationship with Michael, the increasing tension with his wife, and the pressure of maintaining his reputation as a public figure. According to Dr. Klein, these factors had contributed to a mental breakdown, one that had left Daniel in a state of fear and paralysis when the murders occurred. Daniel Monroe was not acting out of malice, Dr. Klein testified. He was acting out of fear. Fear for his life, fear for his family, and fear of losing everything. His actions, or lack thereof, were not the actions of a man in control. They were the actions of a man who had lost all sense of perspective. The defense rested its case. As the trial moved into its closing arguments, Daniel sat in his seat, his hands folded tightly in front of him. He had no idea how this would end. Would the jury see him as the man he believed himself to be? A man who had made terrible mistakes but was not a killer? Or would they see him as the monster the prosecution had painted him to be? All he could do now was wait. The days dragged on with an eerie quietness in the courtroom. After weeks of testimony, the final arguments had been made, and the jury had been sent to deliberate. Daniel Monroe sat in his seat, his palms sweaty, his mind racing with every possible outcome. He had no idea how the jury would view him. Would they believe his story, that he was a man trapped in a web of fear and guilt? Or would they see him as a cold-blooded accomplice to murder? The room was tense as the minutes stretched into hours. The defense team remained calm, their expressions unreadable. The prosecution, on the other hand, seemed confident, almost smug, as they waited for the jury to return with their decision. Every few minutes, Daniel would glance at the door, hoping for some sign that it was almost over. But each time, the door remained closed, and the wait continued. It was late in the afternoon when the door finally opened. The jury had returned. The judge stood, her gavel striking with authority. "Will the defendant please rise?" Daniel's legs felt as if they had turned to stone, but he managed to stand, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. His lawyer, Robert Calloway, stood beside him, a reassuring presence, though his eyes betrayed a hint of uncertainty. The jury foreman stood up, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Monroe, guilty of accessory to murder in the deaths of Rebecca Monroe and Mrs. Ellison. We also find him guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. However, we find him not guilty of first-degree murder." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Daniel's world tilted on its axis. He heard the murmurs of the courtroom, some in disbelief, others with vindication. His heart sank as the full weight of the verdict settled over him. Guilty. Guilty of being involved, of enabling the murders, but not guilty of murder itself. The relief was fleeting. The conviction still felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The charges were grave, and even though he had avoided the worst, there was no escaping the truth of what he had done, or what he had failed to do. As the judge read the sentencing guidelines, Daniel's mind went numb. He couldn't process the words. The days of his life as a pastor, as a husband, as a man of faith, were now officially over. His life, once filled with certainty, now seemed like a shattered piece of glass, each sharp fragment representing a choice he had made, a step he had taken toward his own destruction. His lawyer, Robert, turned to him with a grave expression, but he didn't speak. The verdict was delivered, and now the consequences would follow. The judge called for a brief recess before moving into the sentencing phase. As the courtroom cleared, Daniel remained seated, his face pale and drawn. His lawyer patted him on the back, trying to offer some form of comfort, but Daniel felt nothing. He couldn't bring himself to care. All he could think about was the look on Rebecca's face before she died, the blood on Michael's hands, and the fact that he had failed. He had failed them all. Hours later, the court reconvened for the sentencing. Daniel stood before the judge, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of the decision pressed on him. The courtroom was once again filled with spectators, and the eyes of the public were upon him. His lawyer spoke first, pleading for leniency. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that Daniel Monroe made grave mistakes, we ask that you take into account his mental state during the time of the crimes. He was not the mastermind behind these actions. He was a man caught in a difficult situation, and his fear and confusion ultimately led to his involvement. He has expressed remorse, and we believe that he deserves a chance at rehabilitation. Daniel could barely focus on Robert's words. He wanted to scream, to tell the court that he was sorry, but there was no excuse for what had happened. No amount of remorse would bring Rebecca back. No amount of regret could change the course of events. The prosecutor stood next, his tone stern. Your Honor, Daniel Monroe may not have pulled the trigger, but he is not without guilt. He enabled the violence, he protected his cousin, and he lied to the authorities. His actions led to the deaths of two innocent women, and that cannot be overlooked. The public needs to know that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Daniel's stomach churned as the prosecutor's words echoed in his mind. He wanted to argue. He wanted to shout that it wasn't his fault, that he hadn't wanted this. But the truth was too painful to deny. He had been complicit. He had done nothing when he should have acted. He had failed to protect the people he loved, and now he was paying the price. The judge looked down at him, her expression impassive. Daniel Monroe, you have been found guilty of accessory to murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The court acknowledges your cooperation during the investigation and your acknowledgement of the role you played in these tragic events. However, the nature of your actions and the lives that were lost cannot be ignored. She paused, and Daniel held his breath, bracing himself for what was to come. Therefore, I sentence you to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He had heard them, but they didn't feel real. 25 years. It was a sentence that would stretch on for what felt like an eternity. The chance of parole after 15 years meant that he could be out when he was in his mid-50s. But that was if he behaved, if he proved himself to be a reformed man. And even then, what was waiting for him outside? What life could he rebuild after everything had been destroyed? The courtroom was a blur of noise as the judge adjourned the session. Daniel stood still, his mind numb, as he was escorted from the room by officers. He could hear the murmur of voices around him, the whispers of the public, the reporters snapping their photos, but none of it mattered. Nothing mattered anymore. Outside the courthouse, Daniel's world was waiting to collapse. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: his past would haunt him forever. Later, in the small, cold holding cell at the courthouse, Daniel sat alone, his head in his hands. He couldn't stop shaking, the weight of his sentence pressing down on him. His world had unraveled, his life torn apart by the choices he had made, and there was no one left to blame but himself. There was a knock on the door, and a voice called out to him. Monroe, time to go. The officers moved to unlock the door, and Daniel stood up, his legs unsteady. They led him out of the cell and through the maze of corridors, his future now uncertain, his life no longer his own. As they walked toward the door that would take him to his new reality, Daniel looked up one last time, his eyes lingering on the fading sunlight outside. There was no escape from this, no redemption waiting on the other side. Only time and the quiet weight of the past that would never leave him. Daniel Monroe would spend the next 15 years in prison, a man forever marked by his actions. He would try to find redemption, to rebuild his life, but some things could never be repaired. The lessons of his past would follow him every day, a reminder that sometimes the truth is more powerful than any lie. And though his future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The story of Daniel Monroe was one of tragedy, not just of lives lost, but of a man who had lost himself. The road to redemption was long, and Daniel's journey had only just begun.